The golden spotlight falls on a face carved with intensity, eyes deep with unspoken fire, and a voice that rumbles like distant thunder. I'll make him an offer he can't refuse. That single line did more than define a film, it defined an era. It opened the door to the legend of Al Pacino. From Michael Corleone in The Godfather, to Tony Montana in Scarface, to Frank Slade in Sin of a Woman, Al Pacino became more than an actor. He became a living monument of cinema. For over half a century, he has carried roles that were not simply performed, but inhabited, breathing life into characters that remain etched into cultural memory. Few names in Hollywood command such reverence, and even fewer embody both brilliance and endurance the way Pacino does. Yet when the curtains close and the cameras shut down, Pacino retreats into a home echoing with silence. He has known many women, many loves, and fathered 3 children, but never a marriage that endured, never a family that stayed whole. At more than 80 years old, the man who once commanded the world's screens now confronts the quiet ache of solitude. Fame brought him immortality on screen, but at a cost: failed relationships, broken bonds, and the relentless emptiness of nights spent alone. He once admitted candidly, "I was never any good at maintaining a family." Those words carry the weight of a lifetime's truth, a wound that even time could not heal. And behind the timeless performances, behind the immortal roles, lies a man who sacrificed love for legacy. But the truth behind it is much darker. Alfredo James Pacino was born on the 25th of April, 1940 in East Harlem, New York City. His story did not begin in the glittering lights of Hollywood, but in the cramped, gray apartments of the Bronx. His parents, Salvatore and Rose, were children of Sicilian immigrants, carrying with them the heavy traditions and struggles of a community trying to survive in America. When Pacino was just 2 years old, his parents divorced. His father left, moving to California, while his mother raised him alone, struggling to provide stability. The young boy everyone would later call Sonny grew up surrounded by hardship. He lived with his mother and grandparents in a tough neighborhood where violence, poverty, and broken dreams were constant companions. He would later recall how the absence of his father carved a silent wound in his childhood. Loneliness became a familiar shadow, an early echo of the solitude that would define his later years. At school, Pacino was not a star student. He often skipped classes and earned the nickname The Actor because of his habit of mimicking teachers and classmates. But behind the mischief was a boy searching for an escape. That escape came in the form of movies. Sitting in dark theaters, young Al watched screen giants like Marlon Brando and James Dean, and something stirred inside him. He realized acting was not just entertainment, it was a way to live many lives, to transcend the limits of his own. Still, the road was far from easy. His mother disapproved of his dream, urging him to pursue something practical. But Pacino was stubborn. He left high school at 17, working odd jobs, janitor, busboy, messenger, anything to support himself while chasing the impossible. His friends at the time were artists, poets, and musicians, part of a bohemian undercurrent in New York that rejected conformity. Tragedy soon struck when his mother, Rose, died at just 43 years old. Pacino was devastated. He was barely 22, suddenly orphaned, with no father to lean on and no stable path ahead. He later said that her death marked him forever, shaping the melancholy that would color so many of his performances. "My mother's death was the worst thing that ever happened to me," he confessed years later. Yet in the midst of grief, theater became his refuge. Pacino auditioned repeatedly for the prestigious Actors Studio in New York, where legends like Marlon Brando had trained under the revolutionary teacher Lee Strasberg. The first time, he failed. The second time, he failed again. But Pacino's persistence bordered on obsession. He immersed himself in small theater groups, performing in basements and community halls for almost no pay, living on bread and occasional apples because that was all he could afford. Finally, on his third attempt, he was accepted into the Actors Studio. Under Strasberg's method acting philosophy, Pacino discovered the raw emotional intensity that would define his career. He was taught to channel his own pain, his own loneliness, into his characters. The shy, restless boy from the Bronx was slowly transforming into a performer capable of shaking audiences to their core. But success was still far away. He spent much of the 1962nd in obscurity, walking the streets of New York in worn-out shoes, sometimes without money for subway fare. He would perform in tiny off-Broadway productions, sometimes sleeping in theaters after rehearsal because he had nowhere else to go. He was fired from odd jobs repeatedly for being distracted, always thinking about theater. Friends worried about his health, he drank too much, smoked heavily, and often went hungry. Yet, those years of poverty and desperation gave Pacino something no acting class could teach: resilience. He learned how to survive, how to endure humiliation and hunger for the sake of art. And when he finally began to attract attention for his raw, magnetic stage presence, the industry could no longer ignore him. By the late 1962nd, Al Pacino had begun to surface in the world of New York theater, winning critical praise for his role in The Indian Wants the Bronx. His performance caught the eye of influential director Jerry Schatzberg, and more importantly, producer Martin Bregman, two men who would change his life forever. Pacino had survived the loneliness of childhood, the death of his mother, the years of anonymity, and he was about to step onto a stage much larger than he had ever imagined. Because what awaited him next was the role that would define not only his career, but also the image of an entire generation of cinema. By the late 1962nd, Al Pacino had already earned a reputation in New York's theater circles as an intense, fearless performer. His breakthrough came with the play The Indian Wants the Bronx, 1968, where his raw energy impressed critics and audiences alike. The performance won him an Obie Award, a recognition that signaled Pacino was no longer just another struggling actor from the Bronx, he was a force waiting to explode. That same year, Jerry Schatzberg cast Pacino in The Panic in Needle Park, 1971, a gritty film about heroin addiction in Manhattan. The movie was unflinching, raw, and painfully realistic. Pacino's portrayal of a junkie was so authentic that it caught the attention of director Francis Ford Coppola. At the time, Coppola was fighting to cast Pacino as Michael Corleone in The Godfather, a decision that nearly cost him his career. The studio executives at Paramount wanted a star, someone tall, handsome, and known. They pushed for Robert Redford, Warren Beatty, even Ryan O'Neal. To them, Pacino was too short, too dark, too unknown. But Coppola saw something else. He saw the simmering intensity beneath Pacino's quiet demeanor. He believed Pacino could embody Michael Corleone's journey from the reluctant outsider to the cold, ruthless head of the mafia family. The battle was fierce. Pacino was screen tested multiple times. At one point, Paramount even considered firing him midway through production. But then came that scene, The Restaurant Assassination, where Michael kills Sollozzo and McCluskey. Pacino's performance was electric. His stillness, the quiet rage in his eyes, the explosion of violence, it silenced every doubt. The executives finally understood. This was their Michael Corleone. When The Godfather, 1972, premiered, it was not just a hit, it was a cultural earthquake. The film won 3 Academy Awards, became one of the highest grossing films of its time, and elevated Pacino to stardom overnight. At just 32 years old, he was nominated for an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. Suddenly, the boy from the Bronx, once dismissed as too small, too dark, was the face of a cinematic revolution. Pacino's rise was meteoric. He reprised his role in The Godfather Part 2, 1974, delivering one of the most chilling performances in film history. This time, Michael Corleone was no longer the reluctant son, but the icy patriarch. His face a mask of control, his soul consumed by power. The role earned Pacino his 3rd Oscar nomination in just 3 years, cementing him as one of the greatest actors of his generation. But Pacino was not content to be typecast as the mafia boss. He sought roles that challenged him, that allowed him to explore different dimensions of humanity. In Serpico, 1973, he played a real-life New York cop who exposed police corruption, a performance brimming with moral conviction and vulnerability. In Dog Day Afternoon, 1975, he portrayed a desperate bank robber trying to pay for his lover's gender reassignment surgery, bringing tenderness and complexity to a role that could have been a caricature. Both films earned him Oscar nominations, solidifying his reputation as a fearless, versatile actor. Through the 1972nd, Pacino's intensity became legendary. He immersed himself so fully into his roles that friends worried about his health. He stayed up for nights before shooting, rehearsed obsessively, and carried his characters with him off set. He was hailed as a disciple of method acting, channeling his personal pain and history into performances that felt achingly real. By the end of the decade, Pacino was not just a star, he was a cultural icon. Young men imitated his style, his voice, his intensity. Critics declared him one of the greatest actors alive. Hollywood was his stage. And yet, with every triumph, the shadows around him grew darker. The 1982nd were a more turbulent chapter. Some of his films, Cruising, 1980, Revolution, 1985, were critically panned. The failures shook his confidence, and for a time, Pacino retreated from Hollywood, returning to the stage to rediscover himself. Many wondered if his career had peaked too soon. Then came Scarface, 1983. As Tony Montana, the Cuban immigrant who rises to power through violence and cocaine, Pacino delivered a performance so over the top, so explosive, that it divided critics. Some called it vulgar excess, others hailed it as genius, but audiences embraced it wholeheartedly. And over time, Scarface became a cult classic, its lines and imagery etched into popular culture. Once again, Pacino proved that he could reinvent himself, capturing both the madness and charisma of a man consumed by ambition. His career reached another high point in the 1992nd. In Sin of a Woman, 1992, he played Frank Slade, a blind, bitter ex-military officer who finds redemption through an unlikely friendship. Pacino's performance was commanding yet tender, and after 7 previous nominations, he finally won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The moment was bittersweet. A lifetime of brilliance had finally been acknowledged, but it came after years of being overlooked. Pacino's rise was not just about awards or fame, it was about creating a new kind of screen presence. He redefined what it meant to be a leading man in Hollywood. He was not conventionally handsome, not the polished matinee idol. He was short, brooding, with a face marked by hardship. Yet he turned those very qualities into his strength. He made vulnerability masculine, rage poetic, silence deafening. But success, as always, came with a price. While the world applauded his genius, Pacino's personal life was unraveling. The same intensity that fueled his art made him difficult to live with. His relationships faltered, his solitude deepened, and the seeds of loneliness that had been planted in childhood began to grow again. Al Pacino had conquered Hollywood, but the higher he climbed, the further away he seemed from the simple human happiness he once longed for. And as the applause grew louder, so too did the silence that waited when the lights went out. Fame is seductive, but it is rarely forgiving. For Al Pacino, the very intensity that propelled him to greatness also haunted his private life. While audiences saw the master of transformation, the magnetic force on screen, those closest to him often saw a man consumed by work, by solitude, and by his inability to sustain the very bonds he longed for. Unlike many of his peers, Pacino never married. He had relationships with some of the most admired women in Hollywood, Diane Keaton, Beverly D'Angelo, Lucilla Sola, but none lasted a lifetime. Diane Keaton, who starred alongside him in the Godfather trilogy, once admitted that she adored Pacino but could not endure his detachment. Al was simply the most entertaining man, she said, but he never really wanted to settle down. Their romance ended, leaving Keaton heartbroken and Pacino once again alone. His relationship with actress Jan Tarrant produced his first child, Julie Marie, in 1989. Later, with Beverly D'Angelo, he had twins, Anton and Olivia, born in 2001. Yet, despite his deep love for his children, Pacino struggled with fatherhood. He was often absent, consumed by films, rehearsals, and his endless return to the stage. Custody battles followed. Tabloids painted him as reclusive. And though he remained involved in his children's lives, the image of a fractured family mirrored the emptiness he had known since childhood. Pacino himself admitted to the contradiction. Having children has been the greatest gift, but I was never good at maintaining a family. I didn't know how. The words revealed a man caught between two worlds, the immortal actor and the vulnerable son who had once watched his own father walk away. The 1982nd and 1992nd also tested his career. After the box office failures of Revolution, 1985, and Author, 1982, Pacino retreated from Hollywood for 4 years, immersing himself once again in theater. Critics began whispering that his time had passed, that perhaps the legend of the 1972nd had burned too brightly and too quickly. Though Scarface would later become a cult phenomenon, at the time its critical reception was harsh. For Pacino, the line between artistic obsession and professional insecurity blurred. Money, too, became a concern. Though never reckless like some of his contemporaries, Pacino's devotion to theater meant he often turned down lucrative film offers. He admitted that his love for the stage sometimes cost him millions, but he did not regret it. "Acting is not about money," he once said, "it's about survival." As Pacino aged, solitude wrapped around him more tightly. He never remarried, never established the traditional family life many imagined for him. In interviews, he confessed to struggling with depression, with long nights of reflection, and with the burden of being a public figure who was privately lost. Friends described him as both gregarious and withdrawn, capable of captivating a dinner table with stories, then retreating into silence when the laughter died down. There was also the matter of time. Hollywood is merciless to aging actors, especially those who built their careers on raw energy and youthful ferocity. By the 2002nd, Pacino found himself increasingly cast in roles that echoed his past grizzled gangsters, aging detectives, shadows of the men he once embodied with fire. Though he continued to deliver moments of brilliance, critics occasionally accused him of self-parody, of slipping into caricature. The very legend he built now threatened to overshadow him. Yet, perhaps the deepest tragedy was personal. At more than 80 years old, Pacino remains unmarried, a father living apart from his children, a man who walks the line between solitude and isolation. He has acknowledged that loneliness is his constant companion. In 2023, the world was stunned when Pacino, at 83, welcomed another child with his much younger partner, Noor Al-Fala. Headlines blazed with shock and fascination, but behind the spectacle was an undeniable truth. Pacino was still searching for connection, for warmth, for something lasting. And so, while Hollywood crowns him a king, the man himself often speaks with the humility of someone who never quite believed in the myth. "You're only as good as your last performance," he says, dismissing the idea of legacy. But his eyes, weary and haunted, betray the cost of decades spent balancing art and life, success and emptiness. In the end, Al Pacino's downfall was never a scandal of drugs, crime, or destruction, as it was for many of his contemporaries. His downfall was quieter, more invisible: the slow erosion of intimacy, the repeated failure of relationships, the creeping solitude of a man who gave everything to the craft and left little for himself. He once remarked, "The thing I can say about fame is that it's filled with loneliness." And in those words lies the heart of his tragedy. Al Pacino had faced his shadows before: poverty, rejection, grief, but now, in the twilight of his life, the greatest shadow of all was the silence that came when the applause stopped. And yet, the story was not finished. For just as he had risen from obscurity, just as he had conquered doubt and failure, Pacino would face the ultimate confrontation: the inevitability of aging, the fragility of life, and the legacy that would outlive him. Al Pacino's life, much like the characters he embodied, is a study in extremes, triumph and loneliness, brilliance and isolation, love and loss. But the true climax of his personal journey is less about a single event and more about the quiet tragedies that accumulate over decades, a crescendo that echoes the tension of his most unforgettable roles. Even as the world hailed him as a living legend, Pacino's private life remained turbulent. He survived the early hardships of poverty and abandonment, yet the emotional scars of childhood never fully healed. Those wounds became visible in his adult relationships, where passion was often overshadowed by distance. Every romantic affair seemed to circle the same pattern: intensity, admiration, heartbreak, and finally, separation. The isolation he once feared in childhood had become a lifelong companion, silently shadowing his successes. The death of his mother, Rose, when he was just 22, had been the first profound loss, a tragedy that forced him to shoulder adulthood prematurely. Later, the fleeting romances and unstable family connections added layers to that initial grief. Beverly D'Angelo, the mother of his twins, once described him as distant yet brilliant, a man whose presence was electrifying but whose emotional accessibility remained elusive. Even his own children would attest that love and connection were complicated, always tempered by Pacino's devotion to his craft over family life. Professionally, Pacino's apex often coincided with personal solitude. While he delivered the iconic performances in the Godfather series, Scarface, and Sin of a Woman, he paid an invisible price. Fame brought financial security, critical acclaim, and global adulation, but also unrelenting pressure, relentless scrutiny, and a life in which every action was dissected by the public. He was trapped between the desire to live freely and the demands of an industry that never sleeps. Yet tragedy also strikes in subtle, haunting ways. The 1992nd and early 2002nd brought Pacino roles that mirrored his inner battles, aging, reflection, and the shadows of former glory. In films like Heat, 1995, and The Insider, 1999, he played men grappling with power, morality, and mortality. Art imitated life, and life imitated art, as if Pacino's choices were drawn toward narratives that allowed him to wrestle publicly with the demons he carried privately. Even as he embraced fatherhood later in life with twins Anton and Olivia, and then a child in 2023 with Noor Alfallah, there was a sense of fragility. Pacino faced the reality of aging, of mortality, and the knowledge that time was no longer an ally. The man who had once seemed indestructible on screen now faced the universal vulnerabilities of human existence: sickness, loneliness, and the inexorable passage of years. Perhaps the most striking tragedy is that it is largely invisible to the outside world. Unlike many Hollywood legends whose stories are defined by scandal or public downfall, Pacino's tragedies are private, subtle, and deeply human. There are no headlines screaming of collapse. Instead, there is a quiet accumulation of emotional cost. The loneliness of brilliance, the weight of expectations, and the enduring struggle to reconcile a demanding career with a desire for personal happiness. In interviews, Pacino has often reflected on the paradox of his existence. A man adored for bringing life to other stories, yet struggling to craft his own fulfillment. "I am always searching," he once said, "for something real, something that lasts." It is this search that underpins both his greatness and his sorrow, a relentless drive that has given the world unforgettable performances, yet left his own heart perpetually chasing what seems always out of reach. The ultimate tragedy, then, is not a single catastrophic event, but a lifetime of sacrifices, small, cumulative, and visible. Pacino achieved what few ever do: immortality through art. Yet in achieving it, he has continuously sacrificed the ordinary joys of life: marital stability, enduring companionship, and the simple pleasures of domestic tranquility. His legacy is monumental, but the man behind it remains in many ways profoundly alone. And yet, even amid the darkness, there is a glimmer of resilience, a refusal to surrender to despair. Pacino continues to act, to perform, to create. Each role is a testament to his survival, a defiance of time, and a declaration that even in solitude, one can leave a mark that transcends mortality. For Al Pacino, the story of life is not merely about success or fame, it is about the cost of greatness, the quiet tragedies endured in the pursuit of art, and the perpetual tension between the public persona and the private man. Al Pacino's life is a testament to the duality of genius, the dazzling heights of achievement, and the shadows that often accompany it. On stage and screen, he has transformed into gangsters, cops, lovers, and rebels, creating characters that have become permanent fixtures in the cultural imagination. Michael Corleone, Tony Montana, Frank Slade. These are not just roles. They are living, breathing testaments to a man who could channel humanity's deepest contradictions. Today, Pacino stands as one of the most respected and revered actors of all time. His awards, from Oscars to Golden Globes, are only surface markers of the profound influence he has had on acting itself. Generations of performers have studied his work, dissected his techniques, and sought to emulate the intensity, authenticity, and vulnerability that he brings to every performance. Yet beyond accolades, Pacino's true legacy lies in his unwavering dedication to his craft. He redefined what it means to inhabit a character, proving that acting is not merely performance, but a conduit for human truth. Even in his later years, he continues to challenge himself, choosing roles that explore complexity, age, morality, and the human condition. And though fame brought him solitude, he also inspired millions worldwide. Audiences do not simply watch Pacino, they feel him, they live through him, and in doing so, they encounter parts of themselves mirrored in his characters. His life reminds us that greatness is rarely without sacrifice, that brilliance and personal cost often walk hand in hand. Al Pacino's story is not just about Hollywood triumphs or cinematic immortality. It is about a man who gave everything to art, who embraced the intensity of life in all its glory and pain, and who emerged time and again a living legend. The lights may fade and the applause may cease, but the echo of his performances will endure proof that even in solitude and loss, Al Pacino has left an indelible mark on the world. And as we reflect on his life, one truth becomes clear. The man who played gods and gangsters, lovers and outlaws, is himself a legend, a testament to the cost, the beauty, and the enduring power of the human spirit.